My mother looked at me through the glass door of her luxury birthday venue, patted my younger sister's shoulder, and whispered, "Having you in my photos would ruin the aesthetic, Claire. You look far too much like your father, and I spent 20 years erasing his memory." The entire room chuckled as my sister handed her a glass of champagne, leaving me standing in the cold rain outside. They thought I was just a quiet, submissive daughter who would swallow my tears and accept being treated like an unwanted reminder of a bitter divorce. But as I wiped the rain off my face, I pulled a thick leather folder out of my coat. They had no idea that the very building my mother rented for her 50th birthday party, along with the luxury lifestyle my sister flaunts, was funded by my father's estate, which legally belongs entirely to me. My name is Claire Vance, and I am 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, my household operated under a brutal, silent rule. My younger sister, Vanessa, was the golden child who inherited our mother's sharp blue eyes, polished charm, and socialite ambitions. I, on the other hand, was born with my father's dark hair, steady gaze, and quiet, analytical mind. To my mother, Evelyn, my father was the ultimate failure, a man she married for money, fought in a bitter divorce, and spent 2 decades trying to erase from history. Because I carried his exact face, I became the living target for every ounce of her lingering bitterness. I worked hard to build a life of my own, earning my degree and working long shifts as a dedicated trauma nurse. Yet, no matter my achievements, my mother treated my existence like a shadow over her pristine public image. When her 50th birthday approached, Vanessa organized a lavish celebration at one of the most exclusive historic venues downtown. I spent weeks picking out a thoughtful, customized gift, hoping that maybe, just this once, my mother would look at me with genuine warmth. When I arrived at the venue wearing my finest dress, the atmosphere inside was buzzing with laughter, champagne flutes, and high society chatter. But before I could even cross the threshold of the main ballroom, my mother stepped into the doorway, flanked by Vanessa. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, her eyes swept over my face with cold, unmistakable disgust. She flatly told me that my presence would ruin the family photos and that my father's features had no place at her milestone event. Vanessa smirked, taking my mother's arm and adding that it was best for everyone if I just went home quietly. They closed the glass doors in my face, leaving me standing alone in the damp evening air while 50 guests toasted inside. Sitting in my car with a gift on the seat beside me, the quiet, eager-to-please daughter finally died. Now, I'm curious about you who are listening to my story. What would you have done if your own mother publicly excluded you just because of who you look like? Comment below with the city or country you're watching from so I can see how far my story reaches. To understand the monumental mistake my mother and sister were making, you have to understand the true history of my family's wealth, a history my mother had spent 20 years lying about. Growing up, Evelyn constantly spun a narrative that my father was a financially reckless man who had nearly dragged our family into total ruin before she heroically divorced him. She claimed that every luxury we enjoyed was built solely by her own social prowess and hard work. It was a brilliant, calculated lie designed to make my sister and the rest of our extended family look down on my father, and by extension look down on me. The reality, however, was vastly different. My father was actually a quiet, brilliant real estate investor who built a massive portfolio of commercial properties across the city. He was a simple, hard-working man who hated flashy displays of wealth, which constantly infuriated my mother's insatiable desire to live like royalty. Long before their bitter divorce, my father saw right through Evelyn's reckless spending habits and my sister's growing, spoiled entitlement. He knew that if he left any portion of his life's work to them, they would liquidate every single asset within a year just to fund lavish vacations, designer clothes, and high society parties. That is why, when he was diagnosed with a terminal illness 4 years ago, he called me into his attorney's office. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was the only stable, grounded force in our bloodline. Right there, with his estate team present, he transferred his entire commercial property portfolio, his holding companies, and his private family trust strictly and legally under my name. He established a private corporate shield called Vance Global Holdings, making me the sole 100% shareholder, owner, and director. Out of pure respect for my father's wish to keep the peace while he was alive, I kept this entire legal structure completely private. I allowed a management firm to oversee the daily operations of the properties, quietly paying out a monthly allowance to my mother through a designated trust fund that my father had set up to ensure she wouldn't end up on the street. My mother and sister lived in a golden palace of arrogance, completely oblivious to the financial reality of our lives. They genuinely believed that the monthly transfers arriving in their bank accounts came from a generic, faceless family estate managed by old corporate trustees. They had no idea that every single luxury event they hosted, every corporate discount they received, and every dollar that funded their lavish lifestyle was quietly passing through my desk and being authorized by my signature. The very historic ballroom my mother had rented for her 50th birthday party was the flagship commercial property owned by Vance Global Holdings. By closing those glass doors in my face and claiming my father's features had no place in her world, my mother had just slammed the door on the sole owner of the roof over her head. Sitting in my car outside the venue, watching the rain hit the windshield, I pulled out my phone and dialed my estate lawyer. The game had officially changed. The morning after the birthday party, I sat at my kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee, feeling a calm, crystal-clear focus that I hadn't felt in years. The emotional fog of constantly begging for my family's approval was gone. I knew what I had to do, and I was simply waiting for them to make their next move. Right on cue, around 11 in the morning, the heavy wooden doors of the hospital clinic where I work swung open. My mother and sister walked into the waiting room, stepping past anxious patients with an unbearable air of condescending authority. They didn't come to offer a warm apology for locking me out in the rain. They didn't even ask how I was doing. Instead, my mother marched right up to my break room table, tossed a crisp venue invoice onto the surface, and demanded that I transfer $10,000 to her account immediately. It turned out that my sister's extravagant taste had resulted in massive overage charges for high-end champagne and late-night catering at the historic ballroom. The venue management was demanding immediate payment, or they would begin charging heavy legal penalties. My mother folded her arms, looked down her nose at me, and spat. "You didn't have to pay for a dress or a gift last night since you couldn't be inside, Claire. The least you can do as the unwanted daughter is cover this bill to prove you actually care about this family. It's time you earn your place at future holiday dinners." Vanessa smirked beside her, idly inspecting her manicured nails. "Yeah, Claire," she added with a fake, patronizing sigh. "Mom worked so hard to give us a good life after your deadbeat father left us. You look just like him, so taking care of his lingering financial debts through us is only fair." The sheer, staggering audacity of their words left the break room dead silent. They genuinely believed they could publicly humiliate me, treat me like a biological defect, and then demand 5 figures to fund the very party I was excluded from. The old Claire might have broken down or argued back, but the woman sitting before them now just took a slow sip of coffee and forced a quiet, compliant smile. "I see," I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. "If this $10,000 will settle the venue issues and finalize everything regarding Dad's legacy, then let's do it properly. Meet me at the corporate law office downtown at 3 o'clock today. We can review the estate terms, sign the paperwork, and I will personally process the funds." My mother and sister exchanged a quick, triumphant glance. They mistook my calm demeanor for crushed submission, completely convinced that their familiar guilt trip had backed me into a corner. Finally showing some sense, my mother scoffed as they turned on their heels and walked out. They had no idea that they were walking straight into the trap I had spent the entire night preparing. At precisely 3 o'clock, the high-rise conference room at Morrison & Associates sat dead silent. The room was a monument to old money and legal authority, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. My mother and sister sat on one side of the massive mahogany table, practically vibrating with smug anticipation. Evelyn smoothed down her designer coat while Vanessa casually checked her phone, both of them fully expecting me to slide a $10,000 check across the table and beg for a spot at the next family dinner. My estate attorney, Mr. Vance, sat quietly at the head of the table, his face a perfectly neutral mask as he adjusted his glasses. Beside him, I sat in a tailored suit, resting my hands calmly on top of a thick, sleek leather folder. "Let's speed this up, Claire," my mother announced, her voice dripping with patronizing impatience. "We have reservations for dinner, and I don't want to spend my afternoon sitting in a lawyer's office discussing your father's miserable past. Hand over the venue overage settlement so we can get this over with." Mr. Vance didn't utter a word. Instead, he unzipped his briefcase, pulled out a stack of certified property deeds and corporate charters, and slammed them down onto the polished mahogany wood right in front of my mother. The heavy thump echoed across the quiet room. "Mrs. Vance," Mr. Vance began, his voice cold, precise, and carrying absolute legal weight. "We are not here today to issue a loan or pay your venue bills. We are here to formally deliver notice regarding the governance of Vance Global Holdings." My sister let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "What nonsense are you talking about? Vance Global Holdings is the private trust that manages our family allowance. My father left that to Mom." "Your father left nothing to your mother," Mr. Vance interrupted sharply, his eyes locking onto Vanessa. "4 years ago, your father legally transferred 100% of his commercial real estate portfolio, his corporate accounts, and the parent holding company directly to your sister, Claire. She is the sole shareholder, sole director, and absolute owner of every asset in that trust." The smug smiles on their faces froze instantly. I watched the vibrant color drain from my mother's cheeks, leaving her looking sickly pale as she stared at the official Golden State seal stamped on the documents. Her hands began to tremble as she scanned the legal lines, realizing the catastrophic reality. "Furthermore," Mr. Vance continued, sliding a secondary order across the table, "the historic ballroom where you hosted your 50th birthday party last night is the primary commercial property owned by Claire's firm. Because you publicly harassment and excluded the sole property owner, and because you defaulted on venue fees, Claire has officially executed her right to permanently terminate your subsidized residential lease and freeze all secondary allowance accounts effective immediately." "No, this is a lie," my mother shrieked, her voice cracking as she bolted upright out of her chair. "You can't do this to me. I am your mother." I leaned forward, locked eyes with her, and smiled. "You said my father's face had no place in your life, Mom. Well, his face owns everything you stand on. The trap is officially closed. The fallout from that single conference room meeting was immediate, total, and completely devastating for my mother and sister. Stripped of the monthly allowance they had leeching from for years and facing the sudden loss of their subsidized home, their fragile house of cards collapsed within weeks. My mother tried everything to salvage her luxury lifestyle. She launched a desperate, tearful phone campaign to our extended family, claiming that I was a cold-hearted, vindictive daughter who was throwing her own flesh and blood onto the street out of pure spite. But her narrative completely shattered when my legal team released the official property registry and the venue records. The extended family, who had spent years listening to her boast about her self-made wealth, suddenly saw the truth. She had been living off my late father's quiet generosity and my silent management all along. The public humiliation she was so desperate to avoid ended up consuming her entirely. Unable to afford the skyrocketing back taxes and maintenance on their sprawling home without my corporate subsidies, my mother was forced to downsize drastically. She sold her luxury car and moved into a modest, cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outer edge of the city. My golden child sister, Vanessa, whose entire influencer persona was built on flashy vacations and designer outfits funded by maxed-out allowance cards, suffered an equally brutal reality check. With her credit lines frozen and her financial safety net destroyed, her high society friends vanished almost overnight. For the first time in her 24 years of life, Vanessa was forced to take a grueling retail job just to cover her own basic living expenses. As for me, standing up to them didn't just protect my father's legacy, it gave me a profound, unbreakable peace of mind. I used my father's commercial portfolio to fund a nonprofit health clinic for low-income families, honoring his quiet, hardworking spirit in a way that actually mattered. I cut off all contact with my mother and sister, refusing to let their toxic entitlement or manipulation drain my life ever again. Every time I look in the mirror now and see my father's features, his dark hair, steady gaze, and quiet strength, I don't feel an ounce of shame. I feel pride, knowing I carried his legacy with dignity and stood my ground when it mattered most. Now, I'm deeply curious about all of you who followed my story until the very end. What would you have done if you were standing in my exact shoes? Would you have permanently cut off a mother who excluded you over your appearance? Or would you have given her one final chance? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to mention the city or country you're watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. Thank you so much for watching.